Shalom and welcome again to another edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. Thank you for being with us. With these podcasts, we hope to explore issues that touch us, our families, and our community in light of the revolution in longevity that is reshaping our Jewish world. We appreciate your support, and you can follow us on our homepage at the website, jewishsacredaging.com, and we invite you to visit the Facebook page, Jewish Sacred Aging on Facebook. It is a great pleasure that we welcome to the Seekers of Meaning microphone and cameras, Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, who is going to walk us through her project called Dayenu. And I don't think this has much to do with singing a song at the Seder, although it may. But really, Jennie, first of all, thank you for joining us. Dayenu is speaking about an issue that is constantly in front of us on the headlines, was a major factor in the election, if you remember the election, and is going to continue, I think, to emerge as a major focus of the Jewish community and the country as we move forward. And that is the whole issue of the environment. So first of all, thank you for joining us.
Great.
Tell me what Dayenu is.
Dayenu is a relatively new organization, a Jewish call to climate action, and we're mobilizing the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis, we like to say, with spiritual audacity and bold action.
That's it's not a bad T-shirt. What do you mean by spiritual audacity and bold action? Are you going to walk up to somebody and slap them across the faces?
So the climate crisis is both a political crisis and a spiritual crisis in many ways. And Dayenu seeks to support, catalyze, mobilize the American Jewish community to grapple with this crisis, both on an existential and spiritual level, and as a fact that needs to be contended with on a political level. That if we are to avert the most catastrophic impacts of the climate change, which obviously is already happening, it's not something in the future, it's happening, whether we can avert the most catastrophic of impacts has everything to do with what we do, how we mobilize in these next 10, what happens in these next 10 years are actually critically important. So our North Star, if you will, is to ensure that we get to net zero emissions by the latest at 2050, while building a just, equitable, and green economy. And that second part is important because it's not only about emissions, it's also about what is the new reality we're building and who is our justice and all communities centered in that. And the other pillar is what we've been calling spiritual adaptation, which is how can we support Jews and Jewish communities to grapple with the anxiety and grief and questions that this raises, and a belief that those two things are related, that what we need is a spiritually rooted, spiritually sustained response to this crisis, and that, like other movements that are really looking to spiritually rooted activism, that it is, yes, our Jewish values that call us to this work, but we also need, in the very confronting of it, to be understanding that this is also a crisis that we're contending with on a spiritual level. I think that it's almost like the elephant in the room. It's the existential question and crisis of our time.
So why is this a spiritual? I understand the political crisis. I understand the economic, because it has extreme economic impact for the world, not only just the country politically. But talk to me, why is this a spiritual crisis?
So I think people are experiencing this in different ways. And I actually want to say something also about generations in a moment, if I may. But I think that many of us are living with fear and anxiety and guilt, the sense of disconnection that can come from needing to go about our day-to-day lives while also being conscious of this looming reality. And I think that we, human beings, Jews, leaders, clergy, parents, people who are coming of age, are at a lost for how do we metabolize this reality. And I think we have different levels of consciousness about it. I think some of us are up, in the middle of the night with it. And some, I think, just walk around with a vague sense that something bad is happening. But it is the communal backdrop of every family and congregation and community. And as I said, I think of it as sort of the elephant in the room that threatens our very concept that we're going to continue l'dor v'dor from generation to generation. And I think that, 80% of American Jews are concerned about the climate crisis. Most of those 80% are not necessarily engaged in confronting it on a systemic level. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is I think people don't know what to do. It's a big, complex issue. And the other is that it's just so overwhelming to even entertain on how do our souls bear the idea that if we don't make really significant changes, our planet may not be tenable. Our children may not have food to eat and clean air to breathe and water to drink. And that's a very hard thing, I think, to bear. So we kind of disassociate or we, go about our lives. And so part of what is needed in this confrontation is the political mobilization, but part of it is also the space to grapple with all of those, all that it raises, which I think is needed both, we say in Hebrew, lishma, for its own sake, right? Here we are, communities of meaning, communities of values. We need to be addressing this. And I also think it's part of base building, because I think part of how do you live confronting this is by taking action.
But
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm very aware that, your podcast is special in terms of really thinking about, my understanding is sort of the sacred aging process. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is how is this, Dayenu very intentionally is working to build a multi-generational movement. And there are, that's hard. It's one of those things you say, oh yeah, of course, multi-generational movement. There's a reason why there are not so many multi-generational movements. And yet we really believe that that's central. And in doing that, what we've discovered is that the crisis is being experienced differently by different generations. It's never a good thing to totally generalize. But I think there are some certain generalities that have emerged. I think, for example, for those in their latter third of their life, I think there's more of a sense of guilt. I think there's more of a sense of sadness about what is being left to the next generation, and an awareness that they won't necessarily be here to bear the brunt of what's ahead. Right. On the other end, I think millennials and Gen Z kids, right? This is all they've known. I think about my children, they're 20 and 13. This is all they've known. And many of that generation, I think, are more angry. Some feel hopeless or a sense of what's the point? And they're energized. We think about the climate strikes and the ways that they've really been kicking up the pressure. And then you have Gen X, my generation right there in the middle. And for us, I think some of it is that the world's not as we thought it was. The narrative that we grew up with, that you would work for a better and better world and things would keep improving, turned out to be completely wrong. And so I think in addition to worrying about our children and grandchildren, many of us are also mourning the world as we knew it or as we thought it was. So I think, of course, these are generalizations, but I think as we think about what it means to build a multi-generational movement, these nuances are important.
Well, I mean, generalizations sometimes are very valid because they do sometimes share a little light on reality. So, yes, the baby boomers, now looking back, one of the great issues in our generation are grandparents. And so since grandparents have a very special, and this generation of Jewish baby boomers and Jewish grandparents, as the national survey from 2019 showed, are very, very intensely involved with our grandchildren. And one of the issues is, what the hell are we leaving you? We had this dream when we were marching around embassies and in the late 60s and early 70s. And when I was shutting down HUC to go ahead with Dr. Blank and march down the closed down the Cincinnati campus in protest against the Vietnam War, and we were, active in the abortion movement and all the things we were changing. We figured, within 10 years, everything's going to be solved. And we turn around and say, something happened in the last 50 years. And we take a look at our grandchildren. So, what you're doing has significant impact upon grandparents and the legacy that goes on. So that generalization it rings true, because what could have been, but it hasn't been. And, not to do some of the pop culture thing of blaming the baby boomers on everything. But there is this, I can understand where you're going with spiritual, because it does mean, what the heck does this mean for me? And what does this heck mean for the life that I'm giving to my grandchildren? Because it's going to be their world. And we're not going to give them the same level of world that we thought we were going to give them, which is a profoundly spiritual question. Profoundly spiritual question. But how do you, we're in the middle of this huge pandemic, which is restructuring American society, world society. How do you find that niche for Dayenu and climate activism in the midst of just trying to, I'm afraid if I go outside and take a deep breath, I'm going to die.
Right.
How do you begin to manage that?
Yeah. So I think this is clearly a time of disruption and destruction, and unexpected crises. And in a strange way, it also is an opportunity, because let's just start by people's experience of the pandemic. I think we've all understood now more in our kishkas, in our guts, like what disruption feels like. What happens when government isn't prepared and doesn't respond adequately? What happens when we don't listen to science? So I think that there are ways that the coronavirus pandemic is a certain kind of, fire drill dress rehearsal, use the metaphor that you'd like, for a much larger crisis. So I also think that the uprising for Black lives and racial injustice, which is, another sort of the systemic racism in our society that has been once again revealed and lifted up, is also very related to the climate crisis. There's a lot of analogies there. The climate crisis affects all of us, but it doesn't affect us all equally. The disproportionate weight of it continues to be borne by low-income folks, Black, Brown, Indigenous people, poor communities, people living in marginalized parts of the country. And it's almost like the climate crisis is a force multiplier, right? It takes historical inequities and makes them greater. And I think, and that means that how we respond to the climate crisis needs to have justice and an analysis of race at the center. And this is actually very parallel to COVID, right? People before COVID, I think, had a harder time getting their heads around, what does this mean? Climate doesn't affect us all equally. We think about the coronavirus, we're all susceptible to it, but we're also seeing that certain communities and populations are being much more severely impacted by it. So no matter how much money you have or the color of your skin, the climate is going to impact and its destruction all of us, but it doesn't affect us all equally. So why do I mention this? Because I think that part of how we recover from the pandemic, part of how we address racial injustice, and part of how we deal with the economic fallout has climate completely wrapped up in it. Meaning these are not discrete crises. They're almost like they're multi-pronged. And we have to build our country. We have to rebuild our infrastructure. We have to rebuild our economy. And how we do that can either prop up polluting infrastructure and the same unjust economies, or it's an opportunity to dream big and to envision something profoundly different. We have this opportunity to re-envision and rebuild. And the question is, are we going to take it? Are we going to do it? And are we going to be bold enough? Because I think, for us to really make the kind of change that we need to make, one that really transitions our economy to 100% clean energy, one that creates millions of new jobs and upholds environmental justice and holds polluters accountable. To do all of that is a re-envisioning and a rebuilding in a very different kind of way. And I think this is something, we're 2% of the population, and we bring a lot to the table and, historically have played real roles in social movements. And we're a people that has faced annihilation before and has had to reimagine and re-envision a different future. I always think about, I'm not someone who thinks a lot about the temple, the ancient temple, but I do, except on Tisha B'Av maybe, but I do think about it a lot more recently. And the way in which, in the wake of destruction, we had to reimagine and rebuild a very different kind of way of life in Judaism, right? We shifted from the sacrificial offerings to the deeds and prayer and Jewish life as we know it now. So I just share that by way of sort of one example in history of the need to do this. And I think we're in one of those moments now. We're in one of those moments now where we have this opening.
No, I agree with you. This is a transitional moment. We're creating a brand new American Judaism. And the idea that you suggested, which I think is true, is that really none of this is siloed, that it is all interrelated. That everything you're talking about is from the economic, racial, social, climate, even spiritual revolutions that are taking place right now are all interconnected. Again, we're speaking with Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a program to raise awareness and action around climate change and the environment. The website, Jennie, Dayenu.com, org.
No, org, www.dayenu, Dayenu.org, O-R-G.
What was the aha moment for you that allowed your soul to say, this is something that my life's path must take? What was there one thing, or was it gradual?
There wasn't one. It's a great question. So I went into the rabbinate 25 years ago, really wanting to mobilize the Jewish community around issues of social and economic justice. And I think, like many people, I sort of had the environment in a different box, right? There's, that's nature, that's planet, I was around civil rights and people and human rights. And so I worked my whole professional life as a rabbi. I was a Hillel rabbi, engaging young people in service and activism, part of starting Avodah. I was at the Nathan Cummings Foundation, sort of building the field of Jewish social justice. How do we actually build a whole sector? And then most recently at HIAS, working to mobilize American Jewish community around refugee issues. And I think, like many people, I had a somewhat late awakening to the fact that this is, first of all, the existential issue of our time, upon which all else rests. And that at its core, it actually is a social, economic, and racial justice issue, sort of like I was speaking about before, that it's not about the environment out there. It's actually about the future of humanity. And those same principles and values of social and economic justice are at the core. So some of that was my own sort of awakening to the climate crisis, awakening to the way that this is a social and economic justice issue. I think when I think about, you look back and think, to understand a narrative, you often look back and rewrite it. When I look back, what stands out was my experience working with refugees and thinking about what 1 billion climate refugees would mean. I mean, that's just overwhelming to think about. I had a particularly, I had a very kind of relatively minor, but a weather experience in visiting my father in San Francisco one summer when there was a huge heat wave. And people know San Francisco, when I say Mark Twain said, like the coldest winter I ever had was a summer in San Francisco. Like, it's always chilly when we're there in August. Right. And there was a huge heat wave and the whole city shut down. It couldn't cope. It wasn't, and it felt apocalyptic. It felt really apocalyptic. And it was like a minor thing in the scheme of like weather events that are fueled by climate change. But for me, it was a kind of seminal moment. And I think the last piece was having lots of conversations with friends and colleagues about the way that the Jewish community has not been showing up in all its people and power around this. There's a very vibrant Jewish social justice sector. There's a very vibrant Jewish environmental sector, but has been more focused on farming and greening institutions and personal practices and education, all of which are really important. But that we need to be bringing the Jewish community to join. We need all hands on deck. We need all parts of America to be fully showing up with our political power.
So this was a gradual emergence.
Startup at 51. I mean, again, just aware of generational, had not thought that this was at this stage of life would be doing a startup, and really felt called in this moment to take the leap. So 1 year ago, November 1st was when I started working full time on creating Dayenu, and then we launched at the end of April, right at the beginning of the pandemic.
So we're at the beginning of this thing with Dayenu. So let me ask you about some tachlis things. There will be congregational leadership listening to this and colleagues, many of whom are aware and want to do something. Will I be able to go to your website and download programs, resources, a speaker? How do you envision Dayenu coming into the grassroots of the American Jewish community?
Great question. So we have intentionally set out to work with individuals, to work with Jewish communities, and to work with institutions, because we really believe that we need sort of all three spheres of Jewish life for us to really build a robust movement. So our grassroots mobilizing and organizing model are Dayenu circles. So Dayenu circles are small groups of 5 to 10, 15 people who want to collectively take action and engage more people in key moments. And we have Dayenu circles that are starting to form across the country. Some are in synagogues, some are like green teams who form great Dayenu circles. Some are, a group of preschool parents at a Hillel, a JCC. Some are in other organizations, like we're in conversation with Urban Adama starting one. There are Hillels that are working to start them. They also can be someone in their living room. I mean, post-COVID, when people return to having gatherings in their living room, we have one or two that have come up in neighborhoods. And so these are groups we offer resources and training and webinars and ways, one-on-one coaching for leaders. On our website is a whole set of resources for starting a Dayenu circle. And then Dayenu circles engage with Dayenu campaigns, which are largely national campaigns. We started with a Just Green Recovery campaign. We just wrapped up Chutzpah 2020, which was our Get Out the Vote. We reached 750,000 voters in key states with nearly 1,000 volunteers across the country for Chutzpah 2020. So Dayenu circles engage with Dayenu campaigns, and they also can work on local issues. So they may also decide they want to work on a state issue or a very local issue or an institutional, greening their synagogue type issue. And then over time, we're creating a network of all of these Dayenu circles. So that's on the kind of grassroots level. There are also ways for people to get involved just as individuals. So like Chutzpah 2020, we had volunteers who just came, as themselves, not part of any particular circle. We're launching the next stage of the Chutzpah campaign, calling on our elected officials to have the chutzpah to take bold action on climate on day one. There's a lot that that President-elect Biden and members of Congress can do from day one. Plenty that can be done through executive action. We have sort of a seven-point call, and that petition will be, by the time this airs, will be live. And then we're also working with Jewish institutions and organizations. So, for example, the Chutzpah 2020 campaign, we had about 43 different Jewish organizations that signed on as organizational partners to it. Because what we're finding is that a lot of organizations that don't work explicitly on climate have members and constituents and people who are hungry to do something. And so they've appreciated being able to partner with an organization that is creating meaningful pathways for people to take action together with others.
How big is your staff?
Our staff right now, we are small but mighty. We are 3.5 full-time employees, and then we have about 6 consultants in various roles. So, for example, there's someone who's working 2 days a week on developing all of our spiritual adaptation workshops, which we're going to start piloting in early January. We have someone who works on our communications and social media, different consultant roles. And we're growing.
Let me ask you to put on your seminary kippah for a second. Do you have plans, or is it in the works? Because I would imagine that a fertile field, not to mix metaphors, for awareness of Dayenu and its programs are in rabbinic seminaries with future rabbinic students, future rabbis and cantors who are going to go out into the field and have direct access to people and adults and children. Are you in touch or trying to get in touch with the various seminaries across the denominations to try to get at least a seminar or a program for students?
We are definitely in touch with the different rabbinic seminaries. We actually had 4 rabbinic interns who were organizing interns for Chutzpah 2020, and I've spoken to various rabbinical school classes and gatherings. Absolutely. And I think, and also done a lot of programs, obviously with rabbis and synagogues. I think that increasingly this will also be an issue that rabbis will be supporting their communities in grappling with. Again, on both a spiritual level, a political level, over increasingly around mutual support and community building as climate impacts start hitting home more and more. I think if we speak obviously with our colleagues in California or Florida, Louisiana, this is very real for what they're contending with. So I think this is a central part of, I think, the rabbinate of the near future.
Yeah, I mean, I could also see you reaching out. You have a limited staff and probably a limited budget, but just off the top of my head, because I've worked with them, like the World Union, because climate issues in various parts of the world are very, very pronounced. And the World Union, we just had Rabbi Bergman, who's the president, on one of our podcasts in November, the beginning of November. But that's another resource, just even on their website to link and at least get you out into the touch with progressive congregations all over the world. Because, last year there's this huge heat wave in Europe, and they're not used to it. And it was purely climate change. It had nothing to do with anything else other than the planet was changing and the ice caps are melting and et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, there are lots of other resources that you could, for no money, link onto and get the word out. And once again, give me the website. And if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, say, this is something that really touches me, I need to get involved with this, how do they do that?
www.dayenu, DAYENU.org, O-R-G, or info at, if you want an email address, info@dayenu.org. Yeah. And we are really focused on America and American Jewry. Obviously, the climate crisis is a global crisis. And America has a particular, I think, role to play in that global crisis. And as a small new organization, we really needed to sort of scope, and particularly one focused on American policy. Obviously, every country has its own political system and role that it plays. And I'm actually speaking at Limud in London, apropos of Europe. I mean, London from my desk here in New York, the way everyone travels now. Speaking in London with rabbis from Europe and Israel, about the way that this is playing out in different countries and different Jewish communities, and South America as well, for sure.
Then forget my suggestion.
Yeah. No.
Are you working with the RAC, the Religious Action Center?
Yes, we partner very much with the RAC. Very close partner.
as we begin to run out of time, if you wanted to send out one message on this to the American Jewish community, what is it?
One message, and then just a thought about our name, Dayenu, if I may, to wrap up. So the thought that I would share is that we need to be making systemic change. Obviously, composting, eating less meat, greening our institutions, all of that personal and communal practice is important. And if every Jew and every institution did those things, we would not avert the worst of climate disaster. That has to happen on a more systemic level. And the statistic that I think most reflects this is when you think back to May, when half the world was shut down, emissions only fell 17%. Yes, the air was cleaner. We heard more birds. It was only 17% because the other 83% is embedded in our industry and economies and infrastructure. So what Dayenu really seeks to do is to give Jews and Jewish communities and Jewish institutions accessible ways through the strategies that we design and the partnerships that we have with the larger climate movement to engage on that systemic level, making the kind of change that is actually going to be able to pull us back from the brink. And I'll close with, I think the other message, which is one of both urgency and hope, right? There's incredible urgency and direness, and there's still hope. There is still absolutely the possibility for change. And we call ourselves Dayenu as a double entendre, right? Dayenu is the song. We all know, we sing at Passover. It's a joyous song, a song of gratitude. We usually think of it as it would have been enough. That's in the Seder context. Dayenu means also we've had enough. We've had enough with climate destruction. We've had enough with inaction and inadequate addressing it. We've had enough with the impacts disproportionately falling on Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. We've had enough, Dayenu. And Dayenu also means we have enough. We have what we need to address this crisis. And we do. We have the resources, we have the technology, we have the policies, we have the people, we have the power. We have enough such that we can create a world in which everyone can have enough. And that's why we call ourselves Dayenu, really in an effort to hold out both of those, the urgency of Dayenu and the possibility of Dayenu. Because now is really the time for us to join together in this very urgent and sacred work. And nothing less than the future of humanity is at stake, which is part of why I so appreciate this opportunity to talk with you and to talk with your community.
No, I appreciate your time. Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, the founder and CEO of Dayenu, and that call to spiritual audacity. It's a great term. And I thank you. I wish you good luck, good health.
Thank you. Thank you.
Especially right now. And just keep the faith and keep that audacity going because that will change the world. It will change it. So thank you, Jennie. Take care. To all of you, I want to thank you again for being a part of today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the TV show and podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. Remember, the show is now available as a TV podcast on Roku streaming service. Just visit bit.ly/JSAROKU to add our show to your Roku box. Some of you of a certain age will know exactly what that means. Some of us, it just perhaps sounds like Klingon, but anyway, you know what we're talking about. Again, if you want to comment or send suggestions to us here at Seekers of Meaning, email me, rabbi@jewishsacredaging.com. Again, we invite you to visit the Facebook page. And if you'd like to make a tax-free donation to help support our work, please visit the jewishsacredaging.com website and click on the donate button. A big thank you to our producer, Steve Lubetkin, who is at Lubetkin Media Companies here in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and our program is produced through their auspices. Again, thank you. I'm your host for Seekers of Meaning, Rabbi Richard Address. I look forward to greeting you on our next edition of Seekers of Meaning, the TV show and podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. Todah, thank you, shalom, stay safe, stay healthy, everybody.